Hey everyone, welcome back to Frosty's Abronias, and today we're going to talk about basic Abronia care. I'm really excited to talk about this topic because there's not a lot of good care guides out there right now, I believe. Personally, I think a lot of them are outdated, old, and just not up to par. This is going to be more of an introduction to care rather than an in-depth care guide. The reason why is a lot of these topics could be broken down into their own 10-minute videos, and trying to cover it all in one single video just isn't possible. For things like gut loading or specific diets or how to fine-tune your humidity and temperatures, a whole video for those individual topics is kind of necessary, unfortunately. So for those of you who are advanced Abronia keepers or currently keep Abronia, this may be more of a basic care guide for you and way too simple for what you're looking for. But if you're interested in how to care for Abronia and just want to get an idea of what it's like to care for Abronia and what the specs are, this is a good introductory video into the world of Abronias. A few disclaimers before we hop into this video. I want to mention that just because this is how I would recommend caring for Abronia or how I would put my specs for Abronia doesn't mean this is the end-all be-all way to care for Abronia. A lot of people will care for their reptiles in different ways, and that doesn't make them bad keepers or keeping them in the wrong way. There's different ways to achieve the same goal, and I'm totally okay with people achieving that goal in a different way than I would. This is just what I would personally recommend. One thing I want to say before we jump into this video is I would recommend you being an experienced reptile keeper before you get an Abronia. Abronia are more of an intermediate to advanced keeper reptile due to the fact that they require very specific care and they're very prone to stress. I'll talk about their care in a pretty simple way and manner. That way you can see if you think you could care for them just in general, but that's something to keep in mind that they are known to, when they don't have the proper parameters, very quickly not do well. So that's something to keep in mind before we jump into this video and go into the other topics. Is they are very finicky, very similar to chameleons from what I've seen, where they just, if you don't have everything perfect, they could have issues. Now, I'm not trying to scare anyone out there who's very interested in them and really wants to get into them. I was really interested in getting in them, and I only had a handful of reptiles before this, and mine are doing just fine and doing very healthy. It's just something I want to put out there, is they are known to pivot very fast from seemingly healthy to on death's door, which is really unfortunate, and I want to try to prevent that as much as possible. So first off, let's jump into their enclosure and their environment that they need. The recommendations I see most is a minimum of an 18 by 18 by 36 enclosure, that being the tall enclosures for an adult Abronia. I personally recommend a 2 by 2 by 4 or 2 feet by 2 feet by 4 feet enclosure for adult Abronias. The reason why I do this is I think more room is better for these guys. It gives them ample room to move around their enclosures and be able to explore, and they will use that space. So for me, I always recommend more than the recommendation usually. An 18 by 18 by 36 is plenty for these guys, especially some of the individuals who are less active than others. But if you have the availability and space, I highly recommend going for that 2 by 2 by 4 enclosure. Another example of this would be a 2 foot by 18 by 36-inch enclosure, where it's similar to that 18 by 18 by 36, but it gives them a little bit more width. This way you can still fit on a baker's rack if you're using that sort of setup, and an 18 by 18 by 36 will also fit on a baker's rack if you're trying to do that kind of setup, which is something I might look into doing with these guys in the future, and having a modified setup of like an 18 by 36 by 24 or some, you get what I mean by that. The style of enclosure I use is PVC. However, there's a couple other styles of enclosures you can go with. I wouldn't recommend anything glass or wood, as that's going to hold too much humidity in usually and not provide enough airflow. These guys are from the cloud forest, meaning they need ample airflow in their enclosures. So going with something like a PVC enclosure that's modified to have fans and provide that airflow, or doing some sort of screen enclosures like you see with chameleons, allows for that airflow to come through their enclosures at a much better rate. You could also look into things like a hybrid enclosure, which is what I would recommend, and I'm planning on doing a video on how I would build my enclosures again if I were to. You could also check out a video up here about the 5 things I would do differently, and where I cover this briefly. At a minimum, you want to make sure you have a vented top to allow the chimney effect to happen. This is when air from the bottom gets pulled in either through fans or just stagnant air wants to rise. Heat rises. So the chimney effect is when hot air from the bottom moves upwards through the enclosures. So you want to have some sort of top open vent and a bottom vent to allow air to circulate through their enclosure. So to summarize, I would just focus on getting a PVC, hybrid, or mesh enclosure that's at least 18 by 18 by 36. That way you can get them the temps in the size they need. For their environment, I would focus on a bioactive or planted enclosure, not something that's full of artificial plants. Well, that works, and I think that's perfectly fine, especially with like neonates or juveniles, where you want to keep a more close eye on them. For adults, you want to give them that in natural environment with planted enclosures. The reason why is they'll oftentimes drink out of the plants, such as tillandsias or air plants and bromeliads in their enclosure. So giving them that natural opportunity to exhibit their natural behaviors is key and really good for these guys. With a bioactive enclosure, you want to make sure you have a deep substrate. That way you're not getting a backup of water and a drainage layer as well for that water to seep into. For a hybrid enclosure or screen enclosure, you might have to be a little bit more careful due to the fact that it could leak out because you don't have the same sort of drainage system that you would in a PVC class or one of those other style of enclosures where it contains water. I would recommend for those hybrid enclosures or those screen enclosures to have a deep sphagnum moss substrate. This allows your Abronia to go and burrow in them and dig in them, but it also will retain humidity and allow for the water to be absorbed and not really get stagnant in the enclosure. It also makes cleaning a lot easier, as you can really remove all of the sphagnum moss and replace it with new sphagnum moss for relatively cheap. A full-on bioactive substrate is perfectly fine as well, with a drainage layer of leca, a border of some sort of mesh and charcoal, and a bioactive substrate with isopods and springtails is perfectly fine and works great with these guys, and that's what I have in here currently. One caveat I would put with that is I have found that these guys will go down into that substrate later and eat your isopods, so don't focus on getting any super crazy isopods with these guys, as they will probably eat them. If you're wondering what kind of plants you should put in your Abronia enclosure, I would recommend Spanish moss as a big one. It's pretty easy to get and pretty cheap, and you can pretty much put it anywhere in the enclosure and it's going to grow pretty well. It allows them to climb on it, move in it, shed through it. It's a really good plant. It looks really good in these. It's usually like a bright bluish green. You can kind of hang it out and just kind of lay it on the enclosure. You don't have to do any sort of crazy modifications to get it like settled or like pinned in compared to some other plants. I would also recommend tillandsias or air plants. Any variety of air plants works in here. I have a variety of different kinds in here. I couldn't even name them all off the top of my head. I went ahead and just bought a wholesale, like $100 worth of air plants to fill these enclosures with, which gave me a huge variety to work with these guys. Another thing I would recommend is bromeliads. Bromeliads hold water in them, and what Abronia will do is they will go into them and actually drink out of them. One caveat with having bromeliads though is they can defecate in those bromeliads, so you want to make sure you're washing those out at least once or twice a week to make sure that there isn't any stagnant water or anything gross in there that they're drinking. And the same goes for the air plants, as those do hold water too in many instances. I would also highly recommend any sort of orchids and ferns. Those are pretty common in their cloud forest environments. I don't have a ton of them in here, but I do plan on, when I upgrade these enclosures, to add more of those. They also are just stunning. There's a bunch of different micro orchids and ferns out there that you can add. They're really beautiful and really good to add. And I think it's a huge benefit for these guys to have some of those natural plants that are common in their natural environment. Moving on to temperature and humidity. If you guys know anything about Abronia, they like it cooler than most other reptiles. They've adapted a life in the trees of the cloud forests of like Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras, and this means they're used to cooler temps in general. For daytime temps, for most of the year, I shoot from anywhere from 70 to 75 degrees. This way they avoid excessive heat, but it's still enough to keep them warm. Keep in mind, they are still exotherms, meaning they get their heat from external sources to digest their food and grow. In the wintertime, you will want to put them through some sort of brumation cycle, and this usually means dropping the temperatures 10 to 15 degrees for the daytime and the nighttime cycles. And for nighttime, we definitely want to see a temperature drop, usually somewhere in the 60s and 50s. This way they can cool down, burrow into their sphagnum moss for the night, and then come back out during the day as it warms up. Both of these temperatures, you want to drop them about 10 degrees in the brumation cycle. So most of the year, we're going to look at somewhere between 70 and 75 degrees during the day and around 60 to 70 at night, but then take 10 off of that, and that's what your wintertime temperatures would look like. Like I just mentioned, you will want to have a basking spot for these guys. While they do like it cooler, they will still bask due to the fact that they're exotherms, meaning they need that temperature to digest their food well. I personally keep my basking spot anywhere between 82 and 85 degrees. This can vary, which is okay, due to the fact that they will thermally regulate themselves, which means they will find exactly the area and temp they need. I would just avoid going too high, as that can cause burns, or just avoid the area in general. One key thing with a basking spot is you want to keep it in a centralized location, somewhere where it's only in a small area near the top of their enclosure. This way they can go to that area to dry off and get a nice bask. Usually in their natural environment, they use filtered sunlight, meaning they aren't at the top of the canopies getting direct sunlight, they're getting that filtered sun. So I like to put a little bit of plants near my hotspot, that way they can hide and burrow into it, but still get that warmth without having to feel like they're exposed to their environment. Abronia require relatively high humidity compared to many other reptiles, but for the most part, you still want to have those humidity drops during the day, just because that's what happens naturally in the cloud forests. So for the most part, I keep my Abronia for most of the year around 40 to 50% humidity. You're going to see humidity spikes throughout the day and drops, but you want to keep them around that 40 to 50% range due to the fact that they are prone to respiratory issues. So if you don't have a good enough airflow and you have high humidity, they can develop respiratory issues, which they're known to getting and don't do very well when they do get them. So allowing that humidity to drop during the day where you don't mist all day, you kind of let it dry out, and then you spike it towards the end of the day, overnight and in the mornings is the best way to go about it. So when we move into those overnight times where we want to spike the humidity, we really want to see that humidity at the 80, 90 to all the way to 100% if we can throughout the night. We want to keep that humidity as high as we can throughout the night and then dial it back through the day. Having some sort of fans in your enclosure during the day also helps regulate it. I have mine hooked up to a hydrostat, where if it gets too low in humidity, those fans turn off and allow the humidity to pick back up, and then they turn back on again. So I'd recommend looking into getting some fans that you can control to allow better airflow, especially if you go with a PVC enclosure. That way you can make sure air's moving in there, but it's also regulating the humidity where it's not drying out too much, but keeps it relatively high. Like I said, 40 to 50% is where you want to keep these during the day. How you go about achieving that is different in every enclosure. I've seen people use misters and also use humidifiers, where they use reverse osmosis water or RO water. That way they have a mist that comes into their enclosure. I think these are perfectly fine. I don't currently use them in my enclosures due to the fact that I have PVC enclosures, and the misting system, which are Mist Kings, are relatively good enough at keeping the humidity high, and they're so well planted that those things kind of hold the humidity in it as it is. However, if you go with a hybrid or mesh enclosure, you will probably want to look into using some sort of humidifier. One caveat to using humidifiers is you will need to clean them, as they can build up bacteria such as algae and other things that could also get into the air supply of your Abronia. So that's something to keep in mind. It's perfectly fine if using them. It's just something you'll have to keep in mind as you work with them. One thing I would like to mention during this humidity section is Abronia do shed, and they do shed in one piece similarly to a snake, meaning they need humidity around those times where they're going to shed. Otherwise, they could have issues shedding and get stuck shed. It's kind of hard to tell exactly when they're going to shed. They do shed a couple times a year. However, one thing you will notice with your Abronia is a change of color. They wouldn't necessarily go blue like a snake does, where they eyes glass over and stuff like that, but you'll notice their colors aren't as vibrant. And then within a week or two of that is usually when they're going to shed. So it's okay to spike the humidity a little bit higher, about 45% to 55%, a little higher than normal, just to allow for better shedding. Moving on to lighting and UVB. These guys need UVB. They are diurnal, which means they are active during the day, meaning they are going to be exposed to UVB in their environment. However, that UVB is on the Ferguson zone level 3, which means they want filtered UVB rather than high intensity UVB like you would see in the desert. The best way to go about doing this is getting a solar meter, which allows you to read the UVB output of your UVB lights. You can usually get a general idea of where that UVB range is based on like the Arcadia example of how far away it needs to be. One thing I found that's a little difficult though is the venting on your enclosure might dilute some of that UVB. So that's something to keep in mind. If you have the reptile habitats enclosures like I do behind me, they have a very thick mesh at the top, which makes it very hard for UVB to penetrate, meaning I had to get a very high intensity UVB to get that Ferguson zone 3 near the top of that. One thing to keep in mind with UVB is it'll dim off as it goes through the enclosure. So having higher UVB at the top, especially near that heating spot where they would naturally get that UVB, is key. For the lighting I have, I use the Arcadia Luminize setup. That way I can create a natural turn on and turn off cycle where it brightens up and dims down. This more replicates their natural environment of where the light will slowly rise and then descend. I like these a lot. I think they're really great. They're a fun tool to use, especially seeing it turn on during the day and see them emerge as the sun arises rather than just a big bright flash of light is on. Do you need to have an Arcadia Luminize for these guys? No, not necessarily. I think you could use any sort of UVB or LED light to create that photo cycle. However, I recommend the Arcadia products. They've done me well. I haven't had any issues with them, but some sort of LED and UVB that at least gives them that Ferguson Zone 3 is what you'll need for the environment. The regular LED light can be kind of whatever you want it to be. I use their LED bars for Arcadia. However, the LED is mostly used for plant growth and to create that natural lighting. Moving on to diet and feeding. This is a very interesting topic with Abronia because we're still trying to learn better about their natural diet. And we have seen that if you don't give them a proper diet, and specifically if you don't give them proper UVB and supplementation and gut loading, they will seem to lose their colors in captivity. They'll lose those bright greens, those big striking reds and stuff like that. So you want to make sure you're supplementing them and giving them the proper nutrition and a varied diet. For me, I've been feeding my Abronia about every 4 days, 2 to 3 small crickets. However, they have moved into the adult stage, which means I'll be feeding them more like a medium cricket or grasshopper once a week. Now, like I just said, medium cricket or grasshopper, grasshoppers are more natural to their natural environment. The reason being is they're diurnal. They're active during the day, meaning crickets, being nocturnal, aren't going to be something they see very often. However, grasshoppers are something they're going to see often. So I would recommend trying to get a hold of grasshoppers if you're going to keep these guys, as it will display more natural hunting behaviors when you're feeding them. I've noticed them react completely different with grasshoppers compared to crickets and other feeders, so it's something I would recommend. I'll have a link in the description down below of where I get my grasshoppers from. But you still want to have a varied diet. So I feed mine crickets, grasshoppers, mealworms, superworms, dubias, all of those things, just to give them micronutrients that they might not get from one insect, but could get from others. This way they get a little bit of a fattier insect, more of a hydration insect, and more of, your regular protein insect. That way they're getting a varied diet. I've noticed that with my guys, they pretty much eat all of those except Mithrax, who doesn't really like waxworms. Other than that, they pretty much will eat any of the insects I give them. They've also been known in the wild to eat things like moths, butterflies, and even spiders. However, getting those in captivity is a little bit more difficult, and getting them as feeders where they aren't from the wild and have any sort of parasites or anything that could cause them issues is usually pretty difficult. So I wouldn't recommend that. When it comes to diet and feeding, you really want to track their weight to know if they're doing well and if they're eating enough or they need more or less. This way you have a better understanding of how they're actually doing. You want your Abronia to usually be with under 30 grams or around the 30 grams mark. Anything more is usually really out of the norm compared to their wild counterparts. The reason we want to keep them under that 30 gram mark is due to the fact that they can develop things like gout and other medical issues that are associated with holding on extra weight that they don't normally need. I have seen personally Abronia in the 40s and 50 gram range, and they can get quite big in captivity due to this. They're also known for just eating as much as you're willing to give them for the most part. So just be careful when you go about feeding them. A great way of knowing if you are or aren't feeding your Abronia enough is by weighing them. And a great way to go about weighing them is making sure you have them spot trained to get them out of their enclosures. And I have a whole video up here talking about how I went about doing that. One thing that a lot of people want to know when they're getting an Abronia or any other reptile for that matter is how handleable is this reptile? Will I be able to interact with it? Will it hang out with me like a bearded dragon? Or is it something that is completely hands off? For these guys, they're in the intermediate range of handability. I think they are available to be handled, but I think you do need to do some sort of spot training and work with them to build up that trust and confidence between you and them. I don't think there's something you should be handling every day, as that can put a lot of stress on them, and it's going to really depend on the individual at hand. Especially if you get a wild caught individual, it's going to be much harder to interact with them because their natural behavior is going to indicate to them that you are a big, dangerous threat. So they're not going to necessarily want to interact with you as much. However, you should be getting captive bred individuals, and those will be more likely to interact with you due to the fact they're exposed to human interaction, at least in some way. Spot training will also help that, as it'll build a trust relationship with you and your Abronia, so they can be handleable, and they're very inquisitive reptiles. So they'll want to interact and kind of figure out what you're doing in their enclosures over time. But it's all going to depend on the individual. I know some people's Abronias don't want to be interacted with at all. They hide out all day, they don't really see them. But my Abronia personally are pretty much out and about all the time, and anytime I'm in the enclosure or interacting with them, they want to see what I'm doing and interact with me back. You can go ahead and check out my Instagram in the link below, where I post a lot of photos and videos of me interacting with my Abronia and showing how handleable they can be in some instances. Moving on to health and common issues with these guys, something we want to keep in mind is what potential health problems these guys can come in with or develop as we keep them. As we do want to keep them healthy and happy, we need to keep this in mind. Parasite loads are pretty common in new Abronia that you might be taking on. This can be just something that naturally happens in captivity, as you can still get parasites in captivity depending on the feeders that they're getting, but it's more common in wild caught individuals, which we want to avoid. They could usually come in with a much higher parasite load, which is more stressful on the animal and can cause some serious health issues and potentially death even. Anytime you take on any new Abronia or reptile for that matter, you want to make sure you're keeping them in a different room, segregated from the rest of your reptiles, as you don't want to introduce any sort of health or medical issues that could be transferred over to your other reptiles, such as mites, bacteria, or parasites that could somehow transfer to your other animals. I don't have a direct example of this, but I have heard a story of somebody who introduced an Abronia into their Abronia room, which had a viral infection that spread to the rest of the Abronia, causing many of those Abronia to die, which is really unfortunate, and I don't want to see that happen to any of you with any of your reptiles. So it's something you want to keep in mind is anytime you're bringing in a new reptile, if you have other reptiles or other Abronia for this instance, you want to make sure you're quarantining them for at least a couple months, just to make sure and observe that there isn't any medical issues with them that could transfer to your other Abronia or other reptiles in this matter. Another common thing that can happen with Abronia is metabolic bone disease. While I personally haven't seen it in very many Abronia, if they don't get proper UVB supplementation and gut loading, it's definitely something that can occur, and it occurs often in reptiles in captivity as they're not getting proper UVB, proper heating, and proper calcium in their diet. So we want to make sure we are supplementing those things. I personally supplement with calcium, Earth Pro A, and Revitalize D3 following the Arcadia schedule. I'll leave a link down below explaining exactly how that works. They have their own little guide on how to go about, supplementation and stuff like that. And I also gut load my Abronia, which includes things like adding carrots, kale, collard greens, and a bunch of other things to give those micronutrients to your Abronia. You want to make sure that you're serving that food to your feeders at least 24 hours before you feed them to your Abronia. That way they have time to digest them and have them in their system. Those are the main key topics, but I could do a whole video on supplementation and gut loading, and there's many videos online explaining how to go about that. I've seen multiple hour-long podcasts just explaining the necessity of it. So make sure you're going ahead and doing a little research on your own of how to go about doing that. I hope to have a video specifically for Abronia in the future, but like I said about earlier on, there will be a lot of these topics which really need their own video to dive into. Another big issue with Abronia and their health is dehydration. They need humidity and they need that water source at all times. Otherwise, they could have serious issues. That's why I add bromeliads and tillandsias in my enclosures, because those hold water naturally. I also have water bowls that I keep really thin with water. I personally haven't seen them drink out of those before, but I still offer them. And I think you should offer water at all times. You just want to make sure you're cleaning out those bromeliads, cleaning out those water bowls, just to make sure they're not getting dirty and full of gunk that could, cause other health issues in your lizards. Another common thing I've seen, especially in young Abronia, is having a nipped tail or missing toes and fingers. They have really small toes and fingers, so you want to make sure if you're using fans in your enclosures that you have some sort of screen mesh over the top of that. That way they can't get their fingers in there and get them chopped off. Nipped tails happen usually at a very young age where they attack each other. It can happen at an older age where you'll see the tail is almost like a full black or just doesn't look the same. They do kind of regrow their tails, so that is something that can happen and is usually a key indicator if they are wild caught or captive bred. Still can happen in captivity. Mine has a small nip on it that can just happen naturally, but it's something to keep in mind when you're getting your Abronia. Probably the biggest issue I haven't even gone over yet is respiratory infections. I did mention this in the humidity section, but it is still a prevalent thing to talk about here in the health and common issues section of Abronia can still get respiratory infections, and it seems to be pretty devastating for them. Another long-term health issue that they can occur over time with overfeeding and getting into those 40 and 50 gram range is gout, which is an excess of fat in their diet, or usually when they put on too much weight. So that's why we want to keep them in that 30 gram range. That way they don't get too overweight and cause health issues down the road, which can, and gout is one of those things that really isn't curable or reversible once it occurs. What we want to do is prevent it before it happens. Same thing with metabolic bone disease and some of these other issues I have mentioned. Moving on to ethical sourcing and conservation of this species. You're probably now at the section of, okay, I think I can keep these, or no, it's not for me, but you need to know, how do you go about getting your Abronia? Now that you know, I'm ready, let's hop into this. I have everything set up. I want to build an enclosure. I want to do all that. Where do I get Abronia? And this is a very complicated topic due to the fact that Abronia are CITES 1 and CITES 2 species. Since they are CITES 1 and CITES 2 reptiles, their exportation is heavily regulated. If they are CITES 2, it means they can't be exported at all. An example of this is frost eye. Frost eye Abronia don't seem to be able to be exported right now. Now there does seem to be few out there, but they're being heavily regulated, so you probably won't see them. However, there is CITES 1, which means the regulation of them being exported does exist. It's just very limited, meaning very few will leave their origin countries. Meaning if you live somewhere in the US, Canada, Japan, or Europe, you might have a hard time finding them if they're not being imported to your country. There is a few breeders out there that I know of in the US who's working with them. There isn't very many that I would recommend due to the fact that I just don't know them well enough and personally to go ahead and give my stamp of approval on them to you. So you'll want to make sure you're asking the right questions and trying to avoid any wild-caught individuals due to the fact that there's a wide range of issues with going with wild-caught. For example, health issues. They're taking them out of their natural environment, which puts a ton of stress on them, and they may not live or not do well in captivity. Number 3, they're wild-caught animals. They are being taken out of their environments, which plays an impact on their environment, which we want to avoid. Those animals being taken out of their environment is a huge concern to their population when many of these are CITES 1 and CITES 2, meaning they're on some sort of endangered list, either be, slightly endangered or critically endangered. So we want to avoid getting any sort of wild-caught animals. I am currently working in my Discord to get a nice way of going about asking the right questions. I have a whole list in there of explaining, what are the right questions to ask somebody who's breeding them, what do I need to know? That way you can take that list and go with confidence and talk to anyone you want and figure out if they're legit or not. When it comes to getting captive bred ones, you want to make sure you're asking the right questions. You can always feel free to ask me or join the Discord or the Reddit and ask, hey, is this a legit seller? What questions should I be looking for? What do you guys think? I'm always willing to help anybody during their Abronia search, as it can be very difficult to get Abronia in general. You want to make sure that any breeder you're getting from is being transparent, isn't hiding any information from you, and has a good understanding of how to keep their Abronia. Another thing is you want to know how they're taking care of their Abronia before you get it, because that is a very quick and obvious red flag to whether or not it's a wild-caught or captive-bred Abronia. If they know the ins and outs of how to care for Abronia and are willing to give you that information without selling you the Abronia, they're probably more reliable than most breeders out there. As I have found that many breeders, not all, there's very many good ones out there, that hold information back from the general public, and that's something you want to avoid. You want to be making sure that anytime you're working with somebody, that they're being transparent, they're working with you, they're not hiding anything, and they're willing to give you the information you need. That way you feel confident in the purchase you make. So I'd like to reiterate, please go check out the Discord link down below or the Reddit, where I'm working on a seller questionnaire where you can fill it out, figure out whether or not someone's up to snuff or not. It's still in the early progress, and I hope it helps people. But always feel free to ask questions. If something seems too good to be true, it probably is. And that applies to any reptile, even Abronia. Well, that pretty much covers some of the basics you need to know to figure out whether or not Abronia are right for you. I want to say, feel free to ask questions in the comments down below. Reach out to me on things like the Discord, my Instagram, or the Reddit page if you have any sort of questions on how to go about caring for these guys, or any questions you may have about the Abronia journey. I want to reiterate one last time that Abronia aren't exactly beginner friendly due to how picky they can be, how hard it is to source them, and all the different aspects of Abronia in general. However, with that being said, if you're super excited about Abronia, don't be intimidated by the high learning curve. You can get there. It just might take some time, research, and patience. I hope you learned a little bit about Abronia in this video and feel a little bit more confident in going about caring for Abronia in the future, or as you're currently keeping them. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button, the subscribe button, the notification bell, and leave a comment down below if you feel like I missed anything or if there's something you want to learn more about. Thanks for you guys' time. I hope you're doing well. Peace.